this week's episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched the last episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Very, very much appreciated. Apologies for no episode of the show last week. I think it was a case of life getting in the way of art, I think, to butcher a phrase, I suppose. But anyway, back with a bit of a bang this week. So firstly, a really big thank you to a good friend of mine, Giles Murray, for the samples for today's episode of the show. And as you can see from the title page, I'm looking at a selection of the the iconic Springbank 12-year-old Cask Strength. So I think we're in for a bit of an epic episode of the show, to be honest with you. I mean, obviously, I've kind of tasted Springbank 12-year-old over the years, but I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to taste five like this, one after another, and so really looking forward to that. Before we sort of crack on with a bit more of that, just a quick update. As you can see, still in the kitchen. Hopefully not for too much longer. The bookcases will be delivered and fitted next week, and then the week after that will be the carpet, and then, well, hopefully it won't be too long before I've got everything back in there, and, well, things will return to a sort of normality, shall we say. But anyway, so yeah, still a couple of weeks away, before we get back to the normality of the show. But anyway, doesn't really matter where I do it. I suppose it's the content that matters really at the end of the day, isn't it? Anyway, so Springbank, I can't even speak. Springbank 12-year-old. As I said, yeah, it's an iconic whiskey, and I've been tasting it now for far too many years, I think. And I remember sort of, back in the day, 20 odd years ago when I first sort of started doing this, the 12-year-old tended to be more sherry cask than anything else, and a number of them were probably 100% sherry cask, and a few of them maybe a little bit of bourbon, and it was a variable bottling, shall we say. There were some very good releases. There were some shall we say, not quite so good releases along the way. But I must say, over the last 10, 12, 15 years, I suppose, the quality of the 12-year-old has become a lot more consistent. And you could probably argue that the quality of what's coming out of Springbank overall has become a lot more consistent these days. Long gone are the days of sort of like having to taste stuff and go, ooh, not sure about that one. Nowadays it's kind of, well, I don't even have to taste it. I don't really even have to sort of I do have to do some hard work to sell it, but it's now become so sought after that whatever allocation I can get hold of, I can sell quite comfortably, which is quite a nice position to be in as a retailer. But anyway, of course, as per usual, any comments I do make during this week's episode of the show are wholly my own and have no bearing on the company that employs me. Just to be on the safe side. Don't want to upset Springbank now, do I? Anyway, not really a great deal that's much more to say, apart from these are all fairly recent releases, and I've sort of lined them up in kind of stylistic order. So I'll introduce a lineup, and obviously you'll see the reason why I've put them in this particular lineup. So let's introduce the lineup then, shall we? Okay, so we're going to kick off with batch number 23. This was a 2021 release, bottled in September of 2021. 100% ex-bourbon cask, so obviously a good one to start with, bottled at 55.9%. Bottling number 2 comes from this year, in actual fact. This was bottled in May of 2024. It's batch number 25, and it is bottled at 57.2%, 70% bourbon with 30% sherry. Number 3 in the lineup is from 2023, bottled in April of 2023, batch number 24. This is 60% bourbon, 40% sherry, so obviously the sherry component going up slightly. And the fourth bottling is from 2021. This is batch number 22, bottled at 55.4%, and here we have an even split, so 50% bourbon and 50% sherry. And finally we have batch number 21, which was released in 2020. This slightly differs, and this is why it's at the end. It's 25% bourbon, 45% sherry, 25% ex-Burgundy casks, and 5% ex-port casks, possibly port pipes, possibly, don't know exactly, but there you go. So bit of a sort of an outlier, it has to be said, in the range, and quite looking forward to tasting these and seeing how they all stack up against each other. So without much further ado, let's start with the 100% bourbon mature 12. Right, okay, so 100% bourbon matured 12-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, Joe. Very fishy, very briny, quite citric, tangerine, a little bit of orange possibly, a little bit of rose petal, a little bit of sort of youthfulness, quite a bit of oak. I mean, although the oak is taking some time to sort of come in, and it is vanilla'd, quite creamy, a little bit of Campbelltown funk there. I like that. That's a lovely nose. It's, yes, all right, there's a fair chunk of American oak, but the Springbank character is definitely evident there, although, like I said, it is playing slightly second fiddle. Getting quite creamy now. I would guess that there's probably quite a fair few first fill casks were used in this particular vatting, but still, lovely nose. See what the parts are. Quite malty, quite fishy. Apricots, barley, and then woo, in comes that oak. Vanilla, toffee, cream, a little bit of funkiness as it kind of the oak kind of dissipates out on the finish. Yeah, okay, it's good. I mean, you can't argue the balance is there. I think there's a little bit too much oak, a little too much American oak, and I'm probably being really picky here, to be honest with you. I mean, I like my American oak aged whiskies, as you know, but it's the same with sherry casks. You know, if you get too much of it, then they become too dominant. And although I wouldn't say this is overtly dominant, if it was me, I would have just dialed back on the first fill cask a little bit. Anyway, let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to the nose. Quite aromatic now. It's certainly emphasising the oak, but it's also emphasising the citrus as well. Slightly nutty now, a little bit of almost kind of creme brulee possibly. Yeah, I think that's probably brought the nose back into a bit better balance actually. Like I said, although it has sort of emphasised the oak, it's emphasised more of the citric notes, which is just giving it that kind of counterpoint. Let's see what the parts are now. Like the nose. It's kind of, again, emphasised the creaminess of the oak, but it's also emphasised the citric notes as well. Not getting a huge amount of peat in actual fact from this particular bottling. There's a slight earthiness and there's a little funkiness, but I'm not really getting a great deal of peat. Not that you always do, but I just thought I would point that one out. Yeah, okay, I think it's brought the balance a little bit back into line. Like I said, emphasising the citric notes is kind of offsetting some of that sort of overtly creamy oak to a certain extent. So yeah, not a bad one to start with, I think. Okay, so on to batch number 25, so 70% bourbon, 30% sherry. Well, you can get the sherry straight off the bat, although I wouldn't say it's particularly dominant, but it's fairly obvious that there is some sherry component going on here. again, denser, more maltier, sort of vanilla, creamy American oak, raisinated dried fruits. That's nicely balanced. That's how you do sherry. It's not sort of overloading it, it's giving it a nuance, a sherried nuance, a little bit of dried fruit, some spice. Yeah, that is really, really well balanced. Again, not getting any real peat, not getting any real funkiness. It's got a really nice clean character. A little bit of oiliness, a little bit of fishiness. That's good nose. Let's sort of pass on. Kicks off with the American oak, quite creamy. In comes the sherry quite quickly in actual fact, so sort of raisinated dried fruits, dried citrus. The fishiness does kind of linger and continue. I'm getting a little bit of peat now right on the aftertaste. It is quite masked. It's a bit heavy on the oak, so I'm not getting quite so much of the distillery character coming through, although there is some character, so it's not wholly unbalanced, but it is all kind of shifted more into the oak spectrum, not necessarily the sherry spectrum. But there is definitely a sort of a battle going on there between the American oak and the sherry component. And I wouldn't quite go as far as saying to the detriment of the spirit, but it's that battle between the oaks is sort of overly sort of dominating the nose. It's kind of really just brought out the oak again. I'm not really getting a great deal of distillery character at all now. There's a little bit of a fishiness there, there's a bit of a brininess, but again it's kind of almost, there's more emphasis on the American oak, and it all feels not, a little bit on the flat side, shall we say. Let's show the pass right. Palate likewise, it's really sort of emphasised the American oak. The sherry has kind of almost practically disappeared, as has any distillery character in it. There's no peat, there's maybe an intimation of fishiness, but it's all become very sort of oaky and a little bit sort of, Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so let's move on to bottling number 3. So this is batch number 24. This is 60% bourbon and 40% sherry. Well, you can smell that sherry. That's punching well above its weight, it has to be said. Quite grippy, herbal, tannic, fishy, oily. We're sort of, moving into sort of gritty Springbank territory now. There's a bit of American oak coming through now. Give it a little bit of aeration, you get maybe a little bit of marzipan. It's quite fishy, quite briny again. Earthy. I mean, that's a good nose. I mean, it is a little bit more heavy on the sherry, but again, I wouldn't go as far as saying it's out of balance. It's kind of, I mean, that's quite a good nose. I like that. Let's see what pals on. Right, so we open more with the American oak coming through to start off with. There's a little bit of fishiness and Campbelltown funkiness. The sherry kind of starts to move in on the mid palate, bringing that little bit of raisinated fruit, some grippy tannins, a bit of gritty, earthy, a little bit of peat as well. Actually, that's quite a good palate. That's quite complex. It is quite masked, it has to be said. I can feel my mouth watering. I mean, it's only 55%. Well, he says only 55%. I mean, obviously I've tasted higher, but yeah, that's quite quite masked. Let's see what a little bit of, actually 54%, not 55. There, right, so that's kind of dialed down the oak quite nicely. Loads of distillery character now, loads of brininess, loads of fish, oily barley. A little bit more American oak, possibly. Yeah, some tangerine. That's kind of settled it down. I mean, that's a really nice nose. I really like that. That's very impressive. So so far 60-40 split. Good split. You know, 70-30, 60-40. That seems to be a sort of like, so far, a kind of a really nice kind of balance of oak for the 12-year-old. Let's see what the palate like. Okay, again, toned down the oak really nicely. Plenty of distillery character, plenty of fishiness, plenty of apricot. Little dusty, almost violety peat. I often pick up sort of violets certainly in older Springbank. Don't often tend to get it so much in sort of younger Springbank, but there is that slight violetiness right on the aftertaste. I like that. I think that's a really impressive bottle. Okay, so moving on to the penultimate bottling of today. This is batch number 22. So this is the 50% bourbon and 50% sherry. Really coffeed, weighty, oily, a lot more spirit character than I was expecting, it has to be said. Really spirit character forward, a little bit of vanilla, a little bit of raisinated fruit. I'm guessing predominantly refill casks must have been used in this particular batch, because it is quite subtle, the oak. So lots of distillery character. Hickory, walnut, dark malt, a little bit of tangerine. Yeah, that's good. And I think it's coming to show that sort of, you know, a little bit of sherry, judiciously used, refill casks, not too much first fill, and you're onto a winner. It has to be said. I mean, so far, I think the quality is been on an upward curve. See what it passes like. A little bit more oak on the palate, a little bit more sherry coming through to begin with, but it's not too sort of herbal, it's not too oloroso-y, it's not too much grippy tannins. Like I said, feels like quite a few refill, more refill, or probably all refill sherry casks, because it's got a lovely kind of coffeed, almost hickory kind of character. American oak sort of like follows through a little bit of creaminess, and plenty of distillery character, plenty of fishiness, brininess, malt, apricot, citrus, lovely kind of almost ashy peat aftertaste, quite masked. It does kind of like sort of dry out and does kind of emphasize the tannins a little bit on the finish, but again, I think that is another particularly successful bottling. On the palate, a little bit more on the sherry, but quite balanced overall. Right, so it's now emphasised the American oak on the nose. The sherry seems to have kind of almost gone, put its hands up and gone, oh, I'm off. So yes, we're more kind of like sort of refill American oak and sort of fishy Springbank character. Let's see what it sounds like. Again, lessened the impact of the sherry, but it's kind of sweetened it as well. It's also sweetened the barley and the sort of apricot. Not quite, I wouldn't go as far as saying sugary, it's more of a natural sweetness it seems to have added, just mellowing out. Again, it's still got that sort of peat note in the aftertaste. yeah, I think with water that really does kind of work quite nicely. And so, yeah, 50-50 split, refill casks, yeah, good. Right, okay, so moving on to the final bottling. This is batch number 21, which is 25% bourbon, 45% sherry, 25% ex-Burgundy, and 5% port. Let's see what nose gives us. Now, I get the port up front first, to be honest with you. Considering it's only 5%, I'm getting quite a lot of that sort of porty black fruit. There's an edginess there, a little bit of straw, spice. Again, plenty of Springbank character, that fishy, sort of oily, barleyed notes. A little bit of raisinated fruits, a touch of dried red fruits, spice, tannin. Oh, I like this nose. Yeah, if you're going to sort of like play around with your casks, this is a nice balance of casks, it has to be said. And it's not overwhelmed with the spirit. And I think this is the thing with Springbank, it does seem to have that kind of character that deals with oak quite well, apart from obviously if you're going to use an inordinate amount of first fill American oak or sherry. But by and large, if you're sort of like judicious with your oak, it's going to reward you. Yeah, I like this. This is a really complex nose, and like I said, you can pick up elements from all of the casks and the distillery character. What more do you want? I mean, you know, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Let's see what the pass on. Not surprising, it kind of kicks off more of the sherry, but I mean, considering that's 45% of it. Sort of gritty, sort of slightly sort of dry Oloroso, but there's some lovely sweet fruit sort of surrounding that, some sweet black fruit, red fruit, obviously the port and the wine coming through. Not a huge amount from the American oak. There's a little bit of vanilla possibly just underneath the surface, but it seems to sort of hold everything together really quite nicely. A little bit of spice. Again, really complex, lovely balance of casks, and you know, that's a really impressive whiskey, full stop. Let's put a little drop of water, see what that does to it. Right, it's kind of emphasised the sherry, it has to be said. The port and the wine do seem to have kind of pretty much disappeared. Although in saying that, it's still got a little bit of a coffeed note, it's still got some distillery character, it's not kind of wholly gone over into sort of, you know, blandness. There's still some complexity there, it has to be said. Although I think the complexity level has dropped now I've put a little bit of water with it. So pass on. Now, strangely enough, on the palate, it seems to have emphasised the port and the wine. And this is one of the weird things about whiskey. You just can sometimes never predict exactly how it's going to react once you put a little drop of water with it. Now the sherry is lessened and is kind of relegated to pretty much to just coming through on the finish. So it's kind of more porty, more winey fruits up front. Very soft, wonderfully juicy, it has to be said. That has worked really, really well. And again, still some distillery character there. Spices, yeah, that's pretty damn good. Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a really big thank you to my good friend Giles for the samples for today's episode of the show. I think this has been really fascinating. This is the first time I've ever done sort of 5 12-year-old cask strengths in a row, and do you know what? I mean, I think all of them were pretty bloody good. All of them displayed to a certain degree the distillery character, and it wasn't overwhelmed in its entirety by the oak. The first bottling, the 100% American oak, probably the weakest bottling of the 5, and who would have thought that, you know? And I think it's probably more down to the fact that there was more first fill American oak casks used, which just kind of became a little too dominating. But overall, it didn't completely blow the distillery character out of the water, but it did seem to me just to be a little bit too heavy. The batch 25 to 70% bourbon sherry, I think here we started to get sort of a little bit better balance. Again, a little bit overly oaked, possibly, for my, if I'm being overly picky. But again, there was distillery character, so you know you can't argue that it was completely unbalanced. But it was, when you sort of get to the latter bottlings, you start to see how better it is to use less first fill American oak and in turn first fill sherry casks. Batch number 24, the 60% bourbon and 40% sherry, again just really well balanced, all came together really nicely. It seemed to be a good balance of American oak and sherry. It wasn't overly dominated by first fill casks, and it just the balance was really very, very good. And you could say the same thing to a certain extent about the batch number 22, 50% bourbon and 50% sherry. Again, a really nice balance of casks, and again, like I said, you had the elements from both cask types, you had the distillery character. What more do you want? Standout bottling of the day, I think, was the last bottling, the batch number 21 from 2020. Yeah, I mean, I think inspired selection of casks, and it was really nice to see something sort of slightly different with the use of ex-Burgundy and ex-port casks. Hopefully they will do some more bottlings like that, because I thought that was absolutely fantastic. You've got the elements of all the different cask types, you've got the distillery character. Okay, so putting a little drop of water with it did sort of kind of mess with your mind to a certain extent, but sort of neat. I was quite happy with that. I thought the balance was absolutely spot on. And you know, like I say, you know, I'm not adverse to sort of like the use of sherry casks and stuff like that, but it's all about the balance. If you've got too much cask, not enough sort of spirit, then you know it's kind of like a little bit, yeah. And to be honest with you, I taste so many whiskies that are too cask influenced, and you just sort of like go, well, where's the fun in that? You know, it could come from anywhere. But I think at least one thing you can say about Springbank is that you're not going to sort of like mistake it for any other distillery. It is a very unique style of spirit, and great. That's absolutely wonderful. So all that's left to say is I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show. Until next week, good dram.